Hi there, my name is Joe Martin. I'm pastor at First Baptist Church in Toledo, Washington. I want to talk to you for this midweek cabin talk about how we try and reach a place of peace. Now, there really are three groups of people, three approaches. Oftentimes they're rationalized or justified, but the first group generally are you can be a peace breaker, and these are very common. We try to, they're pretty obvious for us as we recognize. These are people who are highly conflicted. They are people who they seem to always have conflict around them. They almost need to have an enemy to make their life work. One person said there are people who don't believe in God, but always need a devil. In other words, they always need somebody to make the dysfunction of their world make sense. And so they will move from one person to the other, one relationship, maybe one marriage, one friendship, from church to church, sometimes from issue to issue. This shows up all over the place. These are highly conflicted people. I would call them peace breakers. They don't mean to sometimes, but they're addicted to chaos. And everywhere they go, they bring a entire kind of thunderhead of drama with them. And these are folks that are known as disruptors. As a matter of fact, it's become a little bit trendy, kind of bougie right now to be a rager. There's actually a small industry. I'm not super, I haven't researched it a lot, but they actually have rooms now. They're called rage rooms where you can rent space and go in and break things and get all your rage and anger out. It's based on some disproven psychological ideas that if you just vent all your rage all the time, that will somehow help you be less angry. Most research and most psychological systems that we've studied say the more that you indulge these things in a bad way that do not lead you to something good, channel them in a good way, your anger, it will almost always result in escalating that kind of rage in its level. They actually have things now called rage retreats where people go off and they're guided in how to express and pull out all of their rage about everything anybody's ever done to them. In other words, it's kind of a piece of the same, probably not consciously related to, but oftentimes in places of the faith, of this kind of deconstruction without reconstruction. I always say deconstruction without reconstruction equals demolition. In other words, what people end up doing is doesn't matter whether it's their marriage or their faith, they deconstruct it, which can be good in some ways. You try and figure it out and try and make it better. But if it doesn't have a reconstruction component, it just ends up being destroyed and demolishing everything. I was reading recently a book by Wendell Berry who was talking about one of the phrases it uses about what happened in America after World War II. They referred to it as the Great Tearing Apart. This was a period where the society, where people had lived in small communities and they lived in pretty much a steady state for a long time with their families. People were scattered. They went all over the country. They moved across the land. Some of it was related to economics. People went other places because they were in the military. This period was called the Great Tearing Apart. It also affected people in rural areas, especially hit them very hard. And of course, when I hear people talk about, people used to say a generation ago, well, after the war or before the war. Now I hear people use a phrase, and this is just strictly my observation, they talk about before and after COVID, almost like talking about the difference between before and after World War II. Now that may be overstated. There have been many things, but COVID had a huge impact, whether you agree with the way it was handled or what your processing of it. And we'll probably all discover years from now, there were things we could have done better or could have done different, or maybe we were completely wrong about. But the great tearing apart is still happening in a new and fresh way in our society, our culture. Communities are torn apart. Families are torn apart. We have people torn apart through technology, where there's all this technological distancing, where people are with each other, physically present, but they're not present anymore. They're in the class, but they're not in the class. They're not with the class. They're in church, but they're not really with the church. And so we have a great tearing apart, and there's a lot of ambient anger going on. Some of it's being encouraged. But the Bible says that being a peace breaker is never something that God in the gospel would tell you. I mean, the Bible says anger is not a sin, but be angry. Ephesians 2:4-26 says, be angry, yet do not sin. And do not let the sun go down your anger. So anger, you can be angry. You may have a need to be angry. There is a righteous anger where you, but there is also a righteous way to express that anger. And you are, no matter whatever the anger is, whether it's righteous or not, it has a time. It has a sunset clause, which says you can't let the sun go down. You have to deal with it with God as best you can in your own heart and come to like a new awareness of what you're going to do. He goes on to say, he says, don't let the sun go down in your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. Let me tell you something. If you give the devil an opportunity in your life through anger, he will always take it. Psalm 37:8, the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, has a lot to say. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret. It only leads to evil doing. Boy, that is played out many times in my own experience. Proverbs 14:29 says, he who is slow to anger, it doesn't mean you never get angry, but you're not a reactor, has great understanding, but he who is quick-tempered exalts folly. In other words, you just literally are a billboard for foolishness. And then Proverbs 25:8 says, do not go hastily to argue your case. In other words, you ever do that where you immediately start to get defensive and you begin to I'm going to deal with this. Don't go hastily and argue your case. Otherwise, what will you do in the end when your neighbor humiliates you, when it turns out that you didn't have the right information, you had the wrong, you jumped on the bandwagon? Don't do that. We live in a society of performance activism right now, where people get online, they know a little bit, they know just enough to be dangerous, and then they throw all in, and the consequences have been disastrous. And then Proverbs 17:14 says, the beginning of strife is like a letting out of water. So abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. In other words, it's like water going over the top of an earthen dam, and it starts cutting through it. And you better back off until you get your spirit in check. Proverbs 30:33 says, but the churning of milk produces butter. I love this one. But the pressing of the nose brings forth blood. So the churning of the anger produces strife. Don't be surprised if you bust someone in the nose. Don't be surprised if you get blood. If you churn milk, you're going to get butter. If you keep churning up anger and stirring up conflict and controversy and division, you're going to get strife. It's a guarantee. It's going to happen. So faced with these truths, we can fall into a couple camps. We can fail to deal with anger wisely, or we can make another error in just trying to avoid all conflict whatsoever, never deal with anything, always just kind of go to ground. You avoid being a peace breaker. In doing that, you make a mistake by becoming a peace faker. And this is really easy to do. This is when you are acting like everything's good, when you really don't like it, when you are really quite unhappy. You go along to get along, but you kind of are cultivating out of your man-fearing spirit. You're more concerned about what people think at the moment than what's really right. Out of that, you're cultivating, in modern terms, what we call kind of a passive aggressiveness, where you're like, okay, it's all fine, but you're really unhappy and you're really angry about it. This is that avoidant tendency that we can fall into. You're a peace faker. And you act like things are fine, but you know it's not fine. And you're probably muttering and you're complaining in another setting. And I've experienced being on both sides of this and being complained about by somebody who was telling you everything was great or everything was fine, or there was no issue, or love you, brother. And then I've been guilty of it as myself. It's a really easy trap to be a peace faker. And so you're not a peace breaker. You're not like out there just trying to tear things up, but you are a peace faker. And so you are a false peacemaker, as Pete Scazzaro says. Jesus said, sometimes you must turn anger into the courage to lovingly confront evil. This is a hard thing for us. You know, we're kind of scared. We don't like conflict, and you shouldn't like conflict, but sometimes you have to turn your anger, you really are angry, into courage to lovingly confront evil. That's why it takes a little bit of time. But what does it mean to be peace faker? This is what Isaiah 5:20 says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. This is a common thing these days. Who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Jeremiah, the major prophet, he said, they have healed the brokenness of my people superficially, saying peace when there is no peace. He says it again, and for emphasis, a couple chapters later, they heal the brokenness of the daughters of my people superficially, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. This is a huge problem. And it's a huge problem in the church. It's a problem in families. It's a problem in marriage. People just bump along in their marriage. They don't want a conflict, but they get distance and more distance and more distance. And then eventually there's going to come, you get far enough apart, you're apart. Matthew said it like this. He said, he wasn't saying you should never avoid things. Matthew 5:22 says, but I say to you, even everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, or raka, shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. And literally, this is a metaphoric statement saying, literally, you just literally create a hell on earth for yourself. Now he's saying, it says it is written, don't murder, but I say don't be angry. And then he gives this remedy. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother is something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go first and be reconciled to your brother and then come and present your offering. What he's saying is they're in Jerusalem. They brought their little offering, their lamb or whatever, and Jesus is talking to people in Galilee, and you remember that you have a problem with somebody and you've never done anything to resolve it. You go back that 80 miles and you try and resolve it, then come back and do your offering. Now, this is hyperbole, but he's saying this is how important it is to confront problems as they come up. And then he goes on in verse 25, Matthew 5, make friends quickly with your opponent at the law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge and the judge the officer, and you are thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out until you have paid the last cent. Now, he's not saying a blanket statement about never go to court or anything like that. He's simply saying, deal with things quickly. Don't let it. Paul goes on to say, don't even let the sun go down in your anger. You know, Paul says you have to confront sometimes. This is part of our role in each other's lives. Ephesians 4:15 says, but speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, even Christ. Now, speaking the truth is one thing. Speaking in love is a whole nother thing. There's more art to it than there is science. And, but you know, you're not going to ever grow up. False peacemakers basically doom the people around you to staying dysfunctional and immature forever. So But the third thing is this: we want to be real peacemakers, true peace. We don't want to be peace breakers or peace fakers, but we want to be true peacemakers. Jesus said it very clearly. This was the defining characteristic of any of his apprentices, his followers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. You want to be known as a child of God, be a peacemaker. Oh, yes, it involves helping them make peace with God, but it means living in a life of peacemaking with others. It is not only that, it's not only a defining characteristic, it's a determining characteristic. It's not a coincidence that verse 10 comes after verse 9. There were no chapters and verses in the original Bible, so it was just a thought. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, who for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. But in the same way, they persecuted the prophets who came before you. You know, one of the best ways to have get hassles is try and be a peacemaker. You know, if you're a peacemaker, if you avoid it, you avoid it. If you're a true peacemaker, you know, this is what happens a lot of times. If you're a true peacemaker, nobody likes you because you're not on their team. You're not on anybody's team. You're on God's team. This is why we avoid these kind of issues, because people attack us and divide from you or divide from us. And sometimes when you confront the difficult issue, they persecute you, say all manner of evil against you falsely on account of Christ. He says, when this happens, rejoice. As a matter of fact, Jesus said another fascinating thing that seems so counter to other things if you don't understand it. But he said in Matthew, 5 chapters later, Matthew 10, verse 34, he said, do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be the members of his own household. This is like seems super upsetting and conflicting. But what Jesus is saying is, when you say the truth to people, when you really speak, you're a true peacemaker. Sometimes it sets a division. Something cannot be true and not true at the same time. I don't believe. I'm not postmodern in my ideology. So we're afraid to confront the problem for fear. And so false peace is easier. But that moves the chance, like I said, for growth or correction or any kind of true peace to ever really happen. To ever come to that place where, like, we're called to live in community as one mind and one heart. And that's a mess, and that's a hard journey, and it has its ups and downs. But we are called to live in one mind and one heart. That means we have to really do this work. And so this takes a great deal of discernment. It takes a great deal of patience. It takes a lot of discretion, and it also takes a lot of time. So, but you know the one thing that it really takes? It takes a lot of courage. If you're going to be a real peacemaker, a true peacemaker, not a false peacemaker, not a peace breaker, you have to have a lot of courage. You have to decide what you really, really want. Do you want do you want broken peace, or do you want fake peace, or do you really want true peace? Do you want a peace between you and other people that's based on mutual respect and honesty? And maybe you're not going to be able to do all the same things together, but you really understand each other. That takes maturity. Now, you say, well, what about people that won't respond to this and they're not going to go along? All you can do is live your life as best you can. You can't, you can't take responsibility for things that are not yours. I mean, God does not give grace to you for things that are not your responsibility. You can make yourself really miserable taking responsibility for things you have no control over. So your job is to lovingly speak the truth in love, to have the courage to take your time, to be patient, to be thoughtful, to not be a peace breaker, just going around creating chaos and drama, thinking that makes you really bold and gutsy. That's nonsense. Not to be a peace faker and just think, Christian nice or whatever, but to be a peacemaker, a really loving, courageous person that says what needs to be said. Thank you for watching this. And if this is helpful to you, or maybe you know somebody it might really help, please share it with them. And we can talk more about it. You have a comment or you want to leave that, you can. Also remember, a lot of you have asked me, you want to give. You can also give at ToledoFirstBaptist.com, and there's a giving menu there. So thank you for this. And remember, this coming Sunday, we'll be talking about, once again, about your heart. And we're talking about how is it that our love, the warmth of our hearts toward God just kind of diminishes. So we're going to talk more about that. God bless you. Thanks for watching.